Book 2 of Deus, Homo by Anselm of Canterbury. That the rational creature was created by God righteous. This is Anselm talking. That the rational creature was created by God righteous, that by enjoying him, that it might be blessed, ought not to be questioned. For on this account, is it rational that it may discern between righteous and unrighteous, between good and evil, between greater good and less good? Otherwise, it would have been made rational in vain. But God did not make it rational in vain. Therefore, there is no doubt but that it was made rational for the end just mentioned. Similarly, it follows that it also received the power of discernment to the end that it might hate and avoid evil, and love and choose good, and still more love and choose greater good. For otherwise God would have given it the power of discernment in vain, for it would discern in vain, unless it loved and avoided things according to its discernment. But it is not consistent with God to have given such a power in vain. Therefore, it is certain that the rational creation was created for this end, that it should above all things love and choose the highest good, not for anything else, but for himself. For if it loves himself for anything else, it loves that and not him. Now this it cannot do unless it is itself righteous. Consequently, it might not be rational in vain. It was created accordingly at once rational and righteous. Again, if it was created righteous, that it might choose and love the highest good, either it was made such to the end that it should at length obtain what it loves and chooses, or not. But if it was not created righteous to the end that it might obtain what it so loves and chooses, it was created so to love and choose it in vain, and there would be no reason why that object should never be attained. As long, therefore, as by loving and choosing the highest good, it does what is right and that for which it was created, it will be miserable, because it will be in want against its will, from not having what it longs for, what is sufficiently absurd. Wherefore the rational creation was made righteous, that it might be blessed with the enjoyment of the highest good, that is God. And hence man, who is a rational creature, was created righteous, to the end that he might be blessed with the enjoyment of God. Again, that he was created such as that he would not of necessity have died, it is easily proved thus, because, as we just now said, it is inconsistent with the wisdom and justice of God that he should compel man to suffer death without any fault of his, whom he created righteous for eternal blessedness. It follows, therefore, that if he had never sinned, he would have never died. Hence, it evidently follows that there will be a resurrection of the dead. For if man is to be perfectly restored, he ought to be restored such as he would have been if he had not sinned. It cannot be otherwise, says Bozo. In like manner, therefore, as man, if he had not sinned, would have been transformed into incorruption with the same body which he then bore, so is it right that, when he is to be restored, he should be restored with his own body, in which he lived in this life. What shall we answer if anyone says that this ought indeed to be the case with those in whom the human race is to be restored, but that it is not necessary for it to be so with the reprobate? Nothing can be conceived more righteous or more fitting than that, as man would altogether, that his body and soul, that had he persevered in righteousness, been blessed forever, so he shall, if he have persevered in unrighteousness, be in like manner altogether miserable forever. You have soon satisfied me of this. From these things it is easy to see that either God is to perfect what he began out of the human race, or that he created so sublime a nature for so great of good in vain. Now, if it be acknowledged that God made nothing of more value than the rational nature to rejoice in him, far is it from him to suffer any rational nature to perish entirely. No rational mind can think otherwise. It is necessary, therefore, that he should of human nature perfect what he began. But this cannot, as we have said, be done except by a full satisfaction of sin, which no sinner can make. I understand now that it is necessary for God to perfect what he began, lest contrary to what is fitting, he should seem to fail in his own undertaking. But if it be so, it appears as though God were forced by the necessity of avoiding what was unbefitting him to procure the salvation of man. How could it, therefore, be denied that he does this more for his own sake than for ours? How, if it be so, what obligation do we owe him for that which he did for his own sake? Nay, more. How shall we even impute our salvation to his grace, if he saves us from necessity? There is one kind of necessity which takes away or lessens the obligation of obligation to a benefactor, and there is another by which a greater obligation for the benefit is due. For when a man bestows a benefit by a necessity he is under against his will, either no obligation is due to him at all, or a less obligation. But when he himself of his own accord puts himself under the necessity of bestowing the benefit, and willingly submits to that necessity, then surely he deserves more gratitude for the benefit. Since this should not be called necessity but goodwill, because he submits to or obeys it under no one's compulsion, but of his own free will. For if what you promise of your own accord today, that you will give tomorrow, you do give tomorrow with the same willingness, although it be necessary for you tomorrow to fulfill your promise, or tell a falsehood, still he to whom you give does not owe you less gratitude for the benefit bestowed than he would if you had never promised at all. For you were not forced to have made yourself a debtor before the time of giving to him. Such is the case when a man of his own accord vows a resolution of a religious life. For although after the vow he is bound by necessity to keep it, on pain of incurring the condemnation of apostasy, and although he may be forced to keep it if he demurs, still, however, if he willingly keeps what he owes, he is not less but rather more pleasing to God than if he had never made the vow, since not only has he renounced for God's sake an ordinary life, but the liberty he had of leading such a life, and he must be said to live a religious life, not of necessity, but with the same willingness with which he made the vow. Much more, therefore, if God accomplishes the good which he began to do in man, although it may not befit him to leave off a good work he began to do, ought we to impute the whole of it to his grace, since for our sake, not for his, for he is in lack of nothing. He began this work, for he was not ignorant of what man would become when he made him, and yet, with that same goodness of his which created him, he voluntarily bound himself, as it were, to bring in perfection that good work which he had begun. In fact, God does nothing of necessity, because he is in no way forced to do so, or hindered from doing anything. And when we say that God does a thing, as it were, from the necessity of avoiding dishonor, which, however, he has no fear of, we ought rather to be understood to say that he does it from the necessity of maintaining his honor. And even this necessity is nothing else but the unchangeableness of his honor, which he has from himself and not from another, and therefore it is not, properly speaking, necessity. Still, we may say that it is necessary for the goodness of God, on account of his own unchangeableness, to bring to perfection in man what he had begun, although the good which it does be all free grace. Granted. Now this good thing, that is the perfection of the human race, cannot be done unless there be some to give to God in amends for the sin of man something of more value than all that exists besides God. So we agreed. Again, he who could not out of his out of what is his own, give to God something greater than all below God, he needs be greater than all that is not God. I cannot deny that. Now there is nothing above all that is not God except God himself. True. No one therefore can make this satisfaction except God himself. So it follows. But yet no one ought to make it except man, otherwise man does not make satisfaction. Nothing seems more just. If therefore, as we agreed, it is necessary that out of man should be perfected that heavenly kingdom, and this cannot be unless the above-mentioned satisfaction has been made, which no one can make except God, and no one ought to make except man, it is necessary that God-man should make it. Blessed be God! Now indeed we have made a grand discovery in what we are seeking. Go on, therefore, as you have begun, for I trust God will help us. We must now inquire how it is possible for God to be made man. The divine and human natures cannot be changed into each other, as that the divine should become human, or the human divine, nor can they be so mingled as that of the two there should be some third nature, whether wholly divine or wholly human. In fact, if it were possible for one to be converted to the other, there would necessarily be God, either God alone and no man, or man alone and no God. Or if they were so mingled as that of the two natures mixed there should be a third, as of two animals, each of different species, male and female, is born a third, which keeps neither the nature of its father entire, nor yet of its mother, but is the third nature of both mixed, it would neither be man nor God. Hence the man-God, whom we seek of the divine and human nature, cannot be formed either from the conversion of one into the other, or from the confusion commixture of both into a third. For neither of these are possible, and if they were, they would avail nothing for what we are in search of. But if in any way these two natures are said to be so united, as that although one be man and the other God, yet the same be not God who is also man, it is impossible for both to do what is necessary to be done. For God will not do it because he ought not, and man will not because he cannot. Therefore, that the God-man may do it, it is necessary that the self-same person who is to make this satisfaction be perfect God and perfect man, since he cannot make it unless he be really God, and he ought not to make it unless he be really man. Since, therefore, it is necessary to find a God-man with the integrity of each nature preserved, it is no less necessary than these two entire natures should meet in one person, like as the body and the rational soul meet in one man, since otherwise it cannot come to pass that the self-same person be perfect God and perfect man. I approve of all you say. It remains now to inquire whence and how God may take upon him human nature. For either he may take it from Adam, or he may form a new man, as he formed Adam from no other human being. But if he forms a new man, not of Adam's race, he will not belong to the human race which is born of Adam, and consequently will not make satisfaction for it, because he will not be of it. For as it is right that for the fault of man should make satisfaction, so is it necessary that he who makes satisfaction should be the same person or of the same race as he who is the sinner, since otherwise neither Adam nor his race would make satisfaction for him. Therefore, as from Adam and Eve sin has been propagated through all men, so no one but they themselves or one who is born from them ought to make satisfaction for the sin of men. Consequently, since they cannot do it, he who does it must needs be born of them. Further, as Adam, and through him his whole race, would have stood fast without the sustaining arm of any other creature, as he had not sinned, so is it fitting that if the same race rise again after its fall, it should rise again and stand of itself. For by whomsoever it be replaced in its former state, By him surely it will stand, by whom it shall recover its former state. Again, when God created human nature, he formed it originally in Adam alone, and was pleased to form even woman, that from both sexes man should be multiplied. And in no way but out of him he clearly showed that it was not his will to inform what he was about to form of human nature, except out of Adam. Wherefore, if the race of Adam be lifted up again by any man who is not of his race, it will not be restored to that dignity which it would have had if Adam had not sinned, and so will not be entirely restored. And the purpose of God will seem to have failed, which two things are inconsistent with God. Therefore, it is necessary that the man by whom the race of Adam is to be restored should be taken out of Adam. If we follow reason as we proposed, this must inevitably be the case. Boso says, if we follow reason as we proposed, this must inevitably be the case. Let me inquire now whether the nature of man to be assumed by God must be derived from father and from mother, as other men are, or from man without woman, or from woman without man. For in whichever of these three ways it be, it will be from Adam and from Eve, from whom is every human being of either sex, and no one of these three is more easy for God than the others, that it should rather be assumed in that way. Well, go on. But there is no need of such much labor to show that that man will be more purely and honorably brought forth of a man alone or a woman than by the connection of both, as all the other sons of men are. That is sufficient reason. The nature to be assumed then is to be taken either from man alone or from woman alone. It can be from no other source. In four ways God may form man, namely, either from man and from woman, as ordinary custom shows us, or neither from man nor from woman, as he created Eve, or thirdly, from man without woman, as he formed Eve, or lastly, from woman without man, which he has not yet done. That therefore he may prove this way also to be within his power, nay, delayed for this very end, nothing is more consistent than that he should take from woman without man, that man of whom we are inquiring. Now, whether it be more worthy of God that this should be from a virgin, or from one not a virgin, there is no occasion to dispute, but beyond all doubt we must assert that it is fitting that the God-man should be born of a virgin. You speak what is well-pleasing to my heart. Is what we have said solid, or is something vain? Is it something vain like a cloud, which you said unbelievers charge us with? Nothing is more solid. Picture then, not upon a fictitious vanity, but upon a solid truth, and say how very right and proper it is that as man sinned, and the cause of our damnation took its beginning from woman, so the remedy for sin and the cause of our salvation should be born of a woman. And lest woman should despair of belonging to the lot of the blessed, since from a woman had proceeded so much evil, it is right that for the re-establishment of their hopes, of a woman should proceed so great a good. Picture also this: if it was a virgin who was the cause of all the evil to the human race, much more is it right that she should be a virgin who was to be the cause of all the good. This picture too: if the woman whom God made of a man without woman was made of a virgin, it is most consistent that the man also, who is to be made of a woman without man, should be made of a virgin. But of the pictures which may be painted upon this ground, that the God-man ought to be born of a virgin woman, these will now suffice. These pictures of yours are very beautiful and very reasonable. We must now inquire further in which person God, who is three persons, may assume manhood. For a plurality of persons cannot take one and the same man into unity of person. Consequently, this must be done in one person only. But of this unity of person of God and man, By which person of the Godhead should this reason be done? I have spoken as much as I think will suffice for the present inquiry in my epistle on the incarnation of the Word, addressed to the Lord Pope Urban.
Still, I would ask you to trace briefly the reason why the person of the Son should be made flesh rather than that of the Father or of the Holy Ghost.
If any other person is to be incarnate, there would be two sons in the Trinity. The Son that is of God, who is the Son even before the incarnation, and he who by the incarnation will be the Son of the Virgin. And there will be in the persons who should be always equal, an inequality corresponding to the dignity of their nativity. For he who is born of God will have a higher nativity than he who is born of virgin. All which are inconsistencies and do not follow from the incarnation of the Word. There is also another reason why it is more consistent for the Son to be incarnate than for the other persons, because it sounds more consistent for the Son to pray to the Father than for any other person to pray to another. Again, man for whom he was to pray and the devil whom he was to overcome have both, of their own wills, presumptuously assumed a false likeness to God. By this they sinned, as it were, specially against the person of the Son, who is acknowledged to be the true likeness of the Father. To him, therefore, to whom the injury has specially been done, belongs the most consistently the power of avenging or of pardoning the fault. Wherefore, since inevitable reasoning has led us to this, that it is necessary that the divine and human nature should meet in one person, and this cannot be in a plurality of the persons in the Godhead, and appears more consistently to be done in the person of the Son than in that of the others, it is necessary that the Word of God and man should meet in one person.
By the way by which you lead me is so fortified on every side by reason, that I see I cannot turn from it either to the right hand or to the left.
It is not I that lead you, but he of whom we are speaking, without whom we can do nothing. He leads so long as we hold to the way of truth. Now, whether that man is to die from the debt of nature, as all other men die from that which they owe, we should not stop to inquire. For if Adam was not to have died if he had not sinned, much more will not this man be under obligation to suffer death, in whom there cannot possibly be any sin, because he is God.
Here I want to stop you a little. For whether he be said to have the power of sinning or not to have the power of sinning, either way there springs up before me no small difficulty. For if he be said not to have the power of sinning, it seems a thing one should be slow to believe. For not to speak of the present of him who has never yet been, as we have but just done, but as of him whom we know, and his deeds too, who cannot deny but that he could have done many things which we call sins. For instance, not to speak of other things, how could we say that he could not have told a falsehood, which is always a sin? For when he speaks to the Jews of the Father, if I should say, I know him not, I shall be a liar like unto you. And among these words he says, I know him not. Who can say that he had not the power to bring forth these same 4 words, or in other words to have said, I know him not? And if he had done this, as he himself says, he would have been a liar, that is, a sinner. Wherefore, since he had the power of doing this, he had the power of sinning.
He both had the power of saying this, and yet he could not have sinned.
Show me how.
All power follows the will. For when I said, I have the power of speaking or walking, there is understood, if I will. For if the will is not understood, it is not power, but necessity. For when I say that I may be dragged captive or conquered against my will, this is not proper, but necessity and the power of another. For this I have the power of being dragged captive or conquered. is nothing else than that another has power of dragging me captive or conquering me. We may therefore say of Christ that he could have told a falsehood if there be understood, if he wished. And since he could not, against his will, have told a falsehood, neither could he have wished to do so. It may no less be said that he could not have told a falsehood. Thus, therefore, he could and yet could not have spoken falsehood.
Now let us turn to the inquiry concerning that man, as though he were not yet in being. As we began, I say then that if he will not be able to sin, because, as you say, he cannot wish to sin, he will preserve his righteousness of necessity. Wherefore he will not be righteous from freeness of will. What praise then will be due to him of his righteousness? For we are wont to say that God made angel and man so as to have the power of sinning, on the account that, although they might have forsaken their righteousness, yet as long as with freeness of will they kept it, they would deserve thanks and praise, which would not have been their due had they been righteous of necessity.
Are not the angels to be praised who now cannot sin?
They are indeed, because this which now they cannot do, they merited by that which once they could have done and yet would not.
What do you say of God who cannot sin, and yet he does not merit this by having had the power of sinning and yet not sinning? Is not he to be praised for his righteousness?
Here I wish you would answer for me. For if I say that he is not to be praised, I know I shall speak falsely. But if I say he is, I am afraid of weakening the case of the angels which I mentioned.
The angels are not to be praised for their own righteousness, because they once had the power of sinning, but because of this, that they have it in some way from themselves that they cannot sin. And in this they are something like God, who has whatever he possesses from himself. For he is said to give a thing, who does not take it away when he can. And he is said to cause a thing to be, who, when he could cause it not to be, does not do so. So therefore, when the angel had the power of depriving himself of righteousness, and did not deprive himself, and had the power of causing himself not to be righteous, and did not cause so himself, he is rightly asserted to have given himself his own righteousness, and to have made himself righteous. In this way, therefore, as he is righteousness from himself, for a creature can in no other way have it from himself, and on that account is he to be praised for his righteousness, and he is righteous not from necessity but from free will, since that is improperly termed necessity, in which there is neither compulsion nor prohibition. Wherefore, since God is perfectly from himself whatever he possesses, he is especially to be praised for the good things which he has and holds from necessity at all. But as I said before, of his own proper and eternal unchangeableness. So therefore, will that man, who is to be the same God himself, since every good thing which he will have from himself, therefore will he be, not of necessity, but of free will, righteous both of and from himself, and therefore worthy to be praised. For although his human nature will have what it may possess from the divine, yet he, the self-same, since two natures are to be in one person, will have it from himself.
You've satisfied me on this point, and I see clearly both that he will not be able to sin and yet be worthy of praise for his righteousness. But now I think we must inquire, since God could form such a man, why did he not form the angels and the first two human beings, such that they likewise might not have been able to sin, and might have been worthy to be praised for their righteousness?
Do you understand what you say?
I seem to myself to understand, and therefore I inquire why he did not form them so.
Because it was neither possible nor fitting that each one of them should be the very same as God, like the man of whom we are speaking. And if you ask, why did he not form so many as there are persons in the Godhead, or at least ones such as this, I answer that reason then by no means required this, but altogether, for God does nothing without reason, forbade it.
I am ashamed of having asked this, But tell me what you were going to say.
Let us say then that he will be under no necessity of dying, since he will not be a sinner.
This I must admit.
But now it remains for us to investigate whether it be possible for him to die according to his human nature, for according to his divine nature, he will be ever incorruptible.
Why should we doubt this, since he is to be really very man, and every man is mortal by nature?
I do not think that mortality belongs to the pure, but rather to the corrupt nature of man. For if man had never sinned, and his immortality had been unchangeably established, he would no less have been really man. And when mortals shall rise again in incorruption, they will be no less really man. If mortality were a part of the reality of human nature, there would be no possibility for a man to be immortal. Corruptibility does not, therefore, belong to the reality of human nature, nor does incorruptibility, since neither one nor the other makes or destroys the man, but one has power to make him miserable and the other to make him happy. But since there is no man who has not to die, therefore mortal is placed among the definitions of man by philosophers, who do not believe that the whole human being could ever have been or can be immortal. Hence the fact that he is to be really man who is not sufficient to prove that the man we are speaking of ought to be mortal.
Find out then another reason, for if you are ignorant how to prove it possible for him to die, I am sure I am.
There is no doubt but that he is to be God. As he is to be God, so he is to be omnipotent.
True.
If then he wished to do it, he will have power to lay down his life and power to take it again.
If he has not this power, he would not seem to be omnipotent.
He will have the power then, if he will, of never dying, and he will also have the power of dying and rising again. Now, whether he lays down his life without any man making him do it, and whether another man makes him do it and allows him, makes no difference as far as his power is concerned.
Undoubtedly.
If then he shall so will as to allow it, he may be put to death. If he be not willing, he cannot be.
To this reason infallibly brings us.
Reason also has taught us that it is necessary for him to have something greater than all things short of God, which he may willingly and not of debt give to God.
Such is the case.
But this cannot be found either beneath him or outside of him.
True.
It must be found then in himself.
So it follows.
He is to give then either himself or something out of himself.
I can comprehend no other way.
We must inquire now of what kind this gift ought to be. For he will not be able to give himself or anything out of himself to God, as though God did not already possess it as his own, since every creature is God's.
So it is.
This gift then must be understood thus, that he shall in some way devote to the honor of God either himself or something coming from himself in a way in which he is not in debt bound to do.
So it follows from what we have said above.
If we say that he shall give himself to obey God, so as by perseveringly keeping his righteousness, to submit himself to his will, to give, this would not be to give what God did not require from him as a debt, for every rational creature owes disobedience to God.
This cannot be denied.
He must therefore give himself or something out of himself to God in some other way.
Reason drives us to this conclusion.
Let us see if peradventure this be to give his life, or to lay down his life, or to deliver himself to death for the honor of God. If this be a debt God would not require of him, since there is to be no sin in him, he will be under no obligation of dying, as we said before.
I cannot conceive it otherwise.
Let us therefore consider whether it be consistent with reason in this way.
Do you speak, and I will willingly listen.
If man sinned by pleasure, is not consistent that he should make satisfaction? Is it not consistent that he should make satisfaction by pain? And if he were so overcome by the devil as to dishonor God by sinning with such ease as that he could not have been more easily overcome, is it not just that man, in making satisfaction to God for sin, should overcome the devil with much greater difficulty, as that greater there could not be? Is it not meet that whereas he so stole himself from God by sinning, that he could not have stolen himself more completely than he did? In making satisfaction, he should so give himself to God as that he could not possibly give himself more completely?
Nothing is more reasonable.
Now then, man can suffer nothing more painful or with greater difficulty for the honor of God willingly and not of death than death. And in no way can man more completely give himself to God than when he delivers himself to death for his honor.
All this is true.
He therefore who will make satisfaction for man's sin must be such an one as shall have the power to die, if he will.
I see clearly that the man whom we are inquiring must be one who shall neither die of necessity, since he is to be omnipotent, nor of debt, because he will never have been a sinner, and yet one who shall have the power of dying of his own free will, because that will be necessary for the accomplishing of his undertaking, that is the redemption of man.
There are also many other things which make it very desirable that he should have the likeness and habits of men without sin. But these appear of themselves more readily and with greater clearness in his life and actions than can, so to speak, before the trial be demonstrated by reason alone. For who will unfold to us how necessarily and how wisely it has been brought to pass that he who was to redeem men, and by his doctrine to lead them from the way of death and perdition into the way of life and eternal blessedness, should have his conversation among men, and by that same conversation, while he taught them by word how they ought to live, give himself for an example. But how could he have given himself for an example to weak and mortal creatures, that they should not swerve from the way of righteousness for injuries or insults or pains or death, if they had not seen him experience all these himself?
All these things clearly show that he must be mortal and a partaker of our infirmities. But all these are our miseries. Surely he will be miserable. Surely, therefore, he will be miserable.
By no means. For as a convenience which one has against one's will does not form a necessary part of one's happiness, so it is not misery knowingly and uncompelled by any necessity to take upon one some inconvenience of one's free will.
Granted. But in the likeness which he ought to have with men, tell me whether he is to have ignorance also, as he has our other infirmities?
Why do you doubt of God's knowing all things?
Because though he is to be immortal from his divine, yet he is to be mortal from his human nature. Now why may he not be like them, a man really ignorant, as he is to be really mortal?
That taking from the manhood into unity of person with the Godhead will only be wisely done by the supreme wisdom. So he will not take into the manhood what is in no way useful but very prejudicial to the work which the same manhood is to do. For ignorance would be useful to him in nothing, but prejudicial in many things. For how is he to do so many and so great things as he has to do without the greatest wisdom? Or how are men to believe him if they know he did not understand what he said? Even if they did not know, of what use would that ignorance be to him? Again, if nothing is loved except what is known, as there is nothing of good which he does not love, so that there will be no good thing of which he is ignorant. Now what is good no one knows perfectly, except he who knows how to distinguish it from evil. This distinction also no one knows how to make who is ignorant of evil. Therefore, as he of whom we are speaking, no evil speaking is to know perfectly every good thing, so there is no evil thing of which he will be ignorant. He will therefore have all knowledge, although he may not show it publicly in his converse with men.
This appears to be, as you say, in his full age, but in infancy. As the fit time will not have come for wisdom to appear in him, so there will be no need of it, and therefore it is not even fit that he should have it.
Have I not said that this incarnation will be effected with wisdom? Now, as God will wisely take upon him mortality, How wisely? Because very usefully he will make use of it. But ignorance he will not be able to take upon him wisely, because it is never useful but always prejudicial, unless perhaps when by it an evil will, which there never will be in him, is restrained from carrying out its purpose. For although it sometimes may do no harm to anyone else, yet in this alone it does harm, in that it takes away the good of knowledge. And to cut short your inquiry from the moment when the man shall be in existence, he will be always as full of God as he will be of himself, and consequently nothing will take place without his power and might and wisdom.
Although I don't doubt this always to have been the case with Christ, yet I ask the question in order to hear a reason for this also. For we are often certain of a thing, and yet do not know how to prove it by reason. I ask you now to instruct me as to how his death can excel the number and heinousness of the sins of all mankind, when one, as we should think the least sin, you show to be so infinite, as that if the number of worlds were infinitely multiplied, so as each to be as full of creatures as this world is, and if they could not be saved from annihilation lest a man give one look contrary to the will of God, yet it ought not to be given.
If this man were present, and you knew who he was, and he were to tell you, unless you kill this man, this whole world, and whatsoever is not God, will perish, would you do it for the preservation of every other creature?
I would not. No, not if an infinite number of worlds were spread out before me.
What if he were to tell you again, either slay him, or all the sins of the world shall come upon you?
I would answer, I would rather bear all other sins, not only in this world, which have been and shall be committed, but also all whatever can be conceived in addition to them, rather than this one only sin. And this answer I think I ought to make, not only in the question of his death, but of any the least harm which might happen to him.
You think rightly, but tell me why your heart so judge as to shrink more from one sin in harming this man than from all the sins that can be conceived, since all sins whatever that have been committed are done against him.
Because sin which is done against his person is incomparably greater than all those which can be conceived of apart from his person.
What will you say to the fact that a man often suffers willingly some hardships in his person to avoid suffering greater in his property?
I say that God, to whose power all things are subject, has no need to suffer such loss, just as you answered before to some question of mine.
You answer right. We see then that to avoid that to the violation of the bodily life of this man, no enormity or multitude of sins can be compared.
That is most clear.
How great a good does it seem to you, if its cutting off is so great an evil?
If its existence be as great a good as its destruction is an evil, the good is incomparably greater than the sins are evil, all which beyond comparison the cutting off of his life excels.
You say truly. Consider further that sins are as hateful as they are evil, and that life is as precious as it is good. Hence it follows that life is more precious than sins are hateful.
I cannot but see this.
Do you suppose a thing so good and so precious is able to suffice for the payment of what is owing for the sins of the whole world?
Yes, and able to do infinitely more.
You see then how this life may overmatch all sins if it be given for them.
Clearly.
If then to give life is to accept death, as the giving of this life excels all the sins of men, so also does the accepting death.
It is admitted to be so with all sins which do not touch the person of God. But now I see another thing to be investigated. For if the evil of putting him to death is as great as life is good, how can his death overmatch and blot out the sins of those who slew him? If it blots out the sins of any of them, how can it fail to blot out the sins of all the rest of men as well? For we believe that even many of those have been saved, and that others without numbers will not be saved.
This answer the apostles answered by saying that, this question the apostle answered by saying that, had they known, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. For the difference is so great between a sin committed knowingly and one committed through ignorance, that the evil which they never could have done, on account of its excessive enormity, had it been known to them, is pardonable because it was done ignorantly. For to put God to death, no man ever, at least knowingly, could possibly wish to do. And so they who slew him ignorantly did not plunge into that infinite sin, to which no other sins can be compared. Now we considered its enormity in order to see how valuable that life was, not as to what his death would be if done ignorantly, but as if it should be done knowingly, which no man ever has done or could do.
You have given a reasonable proof that it was possible for the murderers of Christ to obtain pardon for their sin.
What more do you ask now? For here you see how reasonable necessity shows us that heavenly city is to be perfected out of man, and that this cannot be done except by the remission of their sins, which no man can have except through a man, who is at the same time God himself, and who by his death reconciles men who are sinners to God. Clearly then we have found that Christ, whom we confess to be God and man, has died for us, and we find, though this we knew before beyond all doubt, that all things that he says are certainly true, for God cannot lie, and that all things which he says are done, which he has done are wisely done, must not be doubted, although the reason of them may not be understood by us.
It is true what you say, and I do not in the slightest degree doubt, but that what he has said is true, or what he has been done with reason. But this I ask, that what in the Christian faith seems to unbelievers as though it were not right or not possible to be done, you should show me the reason why it may be right or possible, not to confirm me in the faith, but to delight me, being already confirmed with the understanding of the truth itself. Wherefore, as you have shown me the reason of those things which have been mentioned above, so I beg you to point out to me the reason of what I am about to ask. First of all, how out of sinful mass, out of the human race, God took upon him a manhood without sin, taking as it were the leaven out of the fermented bread. For although the mere conception of the said manhood may be pure, and free from all sin and carnal delight, yet the very virgin of whom he was taken was conceived in iniquity, and in sin did her mother conceive her, and was moreover born in original sin, since she also sinned in Adam, in whom all have sinned.
After it is agreed that the man is God and the reconciler of sinners, there can be no doubt of his being altogether without sin. Now this he cannot be unless he be taken from the sinful mass without sin. But with what reason the wisdom of God did this, we cannot understand. If we cannot understand, we ought not to be surprised. But we ought with reverence to rest satisfied that there is something in the secret of so great a mystery which we know not. For God has remodeled human nature in a more wonderful manner than he modeled it at first, though both are equally easy to God. But man, before his existence, had not sinned, so as to make this more wonderful work necessary. But after that he was made, by sinning he merited the loss of what he was. And what he was made for, though he might not entirely have lost what he had been made for, that there might be something left to be punished, or on which God might have mercy, for neither of these could have been if he had been annihilated. Therefore God reconstituted so much more wonderfully than he constituted him at first, as he did the one out of a sinner contrary to his deserts, and the other not of a sinner nor contrary to desert. Again, how great a mystery is it that God and man should meet in one person, so as keeping the integrity of either nature, the same person should be man who is God. Who then can presume even to conceive that in human intellect can fathom how wisely and how wonderfully so inscrutable a work can be done?
I allow that no man can in this life fully unfold such a mystery, and I do not ask you to do what no man can do, but only to do in as much as you can, for you will do more to persuade me in this matter. Deeper reasons lie concealed. If you will show that you see some reason, than if by saying nothing you prove yourself to see no reason in it.
I see that I cannot rid myself of your importunity, so if in any way I shall be able to show what you ask, we will give God the praise, but if I shall not be able, what has been proved above shall suffice. Now, since it is agreed that it was necessary for God to become man, there is no doubt that he is not wanting in wisdom and power to do this without sin.
I willingly take it so.
It was necessary too that this redemption, which Christ made, should profit not only those who lived at that time, but others. Now, suppose there were a king against whom all the people of some city in some city of his have so sinned, except one only, who is yet of their race, that none of them should do anything by which he might escape the sentence of death. He, however, who is alone is innocent, has such favor with the king that he can, and such great love towards the guilty that he will reconcile all who take his advice by some service which he shall be very pleasing to the king himself, and which he is to do on a day fixed by the king's will. And since all who are to be reconciled cannot meet him on that day, the king grants, in consideration of the greatness of this service, that all who either before or after that day shall be confessed that they are desirous of pardon through that work which is to be done on that day, and accede to the agreement there made, that they are absolved from all past crime. And if it shall happen that after this pardon they sin again, if they will forthwith make due satisfaction and amend themselves, that they shall, through the efficacy of the same arrangement, again receive pardon. And yet the king decrees that no one of them shall enter his palace until this, by which their crimes are to be forgiven them, which has been accomplished. Now, in like manner to this, since all the men who were to be saved could not be present when Christ accomplished that redemption, the efficacy of his death was such that even to the absent, both in place and time, its effect extends. Moreover, it should profit not only those present, is easily perceived from the fact that there could not be so many present at his death as are necessary to the constitution of the heavenly city, even if all who were in existence, wheresoever they might be at the time of his death, were made partakers of that redemption. For there were more demons living at that day than there were men, out of whom the number of lost demons is to be made up. We must not suppose that from the period when man was created, there was any time in which this world of ours, with the creatures which were made for the use of men, had been so empty as that in that there had been no one of the human race belonging to that kingdom for which man was formed. For it seems inconsistent that God should have permitted the human race and all that he created for the use of those out of whom the heavenly kingdom is to be perfected, to exist in vain even for a single moment. Now they might in some way seem to exist in vain so long as they do not subserve the end for which they were made.
By a parity of reasoning which nothing seems to oppose, you show that there never was a time from the period when man was created without some person who had part in that reconciliation, without which every man had been made in vain, and we may conclude this not to be only consistent but even necessary. For if this be more consistent and reasonable than that But at some time there was no one in whom the intention of God in making man should be accomplished. There is nothing else to oppose the conclusion that is necessary, that there should have been always someone having part in the foretold reconciliation. Hence it cannot be doubted that Adam and Eve had part in that redemption, although divine authority does not plainly pronounce this. It also seems incredible when God made them and immutably purposed to make out of them all the men whom he should exalt into the heavenly kingdom, that he should exclude these two from his purpose. Yes, we should suppose that he made them especially to be of those for the sake of whom they were created.
You reason well, since no soul could, before the death of Christ, have entered the heavenly paradise, like as I said just now of the king's palace.
So we hold.
Again, that virgin of whom the man whom we are speaking of was taken was of those who before his nativity were through him purified from their sins, and in that same purity of hers he was formed of her.
What you say wouldn't please me much, except that whereas he ought to have purity from sin himself, of himself, he appears to have it of his mother, and to be pure, not through himself, but through her.
It is not so. But since the purity of his mother, through whom he is pure, was only from him, he also through himself and of himself was pure.
This point is well so far, but now a further question strikes me. For we said just now that he was not to die of necessity, but now we see his mother was made pure by his death. That was to be. But unless she had been, he himself could not have been born of her. How then was it that he did not die from necessity, when, unless he had been going to die, he could not have been existed? For if he had not been going to die, the virgin of whom he was taken would not have been pure, since this she could never have been except by believing in his real death. Nor could he in any way have been taken of her. Whether, therefore, if he did not die of necessity after he was formed of the virgin, he could not be formed of the virgin after he had been formed. For it is not possible.
If you had well considered what was said just now, you would then, I think, have seen your question answered.
I do not see how.
Did we not, when we inquired whether he had the power of lying, show that in lying there are two powers, one that of wishing to lie, and the other that of lying, and since, though he had the power of lying, yet he had it from himself, that he could not wish to lie, and on this account he ought to be praised for his own righteousness, by which he kept the truth.
So he ought.
Similarly, in preserving life, there is the power of wishing to preserve, and the power of preserving it. When then one asks whether the same God-man could have preserved his life so as never to have died, we cannot doubt that he always had the power of preserving it, although he could not have wished to preserve it so as never to have died. And since he had this, namely that he could not have wished from himself, therefore he laid down his life not of necessity but of free power. Those powers of lying, and preserving life were not altogether alike in him. For in the former case, it follows that if he wished, he had the power of lying, but in the latter, it seems that if he had not wished to die, he had not more power than he had of not being what he was. For to this end was he man, that he should die, and on that account of her faith in his death that was to take place, he was able to be taken of the virgin, as you said.
What?
Just as you suppose that he had not the power of not dying, and that he died of necessity because he could not cease to be what he was, so you may assert that he had not the power of not wishing to die. or that he did of necessity wish to die, since what he was he could not cease to be, for he was not made man to the end that he should die, any more than that he should wish to die. Therefore, as you ought not to say that he could not possibly not have wished to die, or that he did of necessity wish to die, so you must not say that he could not possibly not have died, or that he died of necessity.
Certainly, there are subjects to the same reasoning, both to die and to wish to die. Both appear to have been in his case of necessity.
Who was it who was of his own accord willed to make himself man, so that by the same unchangeable will he might die, and that by faith in this certainty of the Virgin, of whom that man was taken, might be made pure?
God, the Son of God.
Has it not been proved above that the will of God is forced by no necessity, but that it preserves itself in its own free unchangeableness when it is said to do a thing of necessity?
Yes, it was indeed so proved. But we see, on the contrary, that what God unchangeably wills cannot possibly not be, but it is necessary for it to be. Wherefore, if God willed that this man should die, he could not possibly not have died.
From the fact that the Son of God took upon him manhood from the wish that he might die, you prove that the same manhood could not have died.
So I understand it.
Did it not likewise appear from what has been said that the Son of God and the assumed manhood are one and the same person, in order that the same may by God and man, Son of God and Son of man, may be God and man, Son of God and Son of man, Son of the Virgin?
Even so.
The same man then could not possibly have not died and yet be dead.
I cannot say that he would.
Now, since God's will does a thing by no necessity, but by its own power, and that man's will was the will of God, therefore he died by no necessity, but by his own power alone.
I cannot withstand your logical conclusions, for I can in no other way weaken the premises which you propose, or the consequences which you draw from them. But yet what I have mentioned above always meets me, namely, that if he wished not to die, he could not possibly have not died, any more than he could not possibly not be what he was, for he was really going to die, since if he had not been really going to die, there could not have been true faith in his death that was going to take place, and it was through this faith that the Virgin of whom he was born and many others were purified from sin. Now, if this faith had not been true, it could have profited nothing. Therefore, if he could by any possibility not have died, he would have made that it to be not true which was true. Why was it true before he died that he was going to die? Because he himself of his own accord, by his unchangeable will, willed it so.
If then, as you say, he could not possibly not have died on account that he was really and truly going to die, he was really and truly going to die because he had of his own accord and unchangeably so willed it, it follows that he could not possibly not have died for no other reason than that by his unchangeable will he willed to die.
Just so. But whatever may have been the cause, it is nevertheless true that he could not possibly have died, and there was a necessity for him to die.
You make much ado about nothing, and as they say, you stumble upon plain ground.
Do you forget what I met your excuses with the commencement of this discussion of ours? Namely, that you were to do what I asked you, not for the learned, but for me and those who with me begged it of you. Bear then with our inquiring in the slowness and dullness of our intellect, so long as you satisfy me and them as you began to do even in our childish questions.
We said just now that it is not correct to say that God cannot do a thing, or that he does it from necessity, for every necessity and impossibility is subject to his will. Now his will can yield no necessity or impossibility, nothing is necessary or impossible except because he so wills it. But he should will a thing to be or not to be on account of necessity or possibility is contrary to the truth of his nature. Wherefore, since all that he wills, and only what he wills, he does, and so as no necessity or impossibility precedes his willing a thing to be or not to be, so neither does it precede his doing or not doing it, although he may unchangeably will and do many things. As when God does a thing, after it has been done, there is no longer a possibility of it's not being done, but it is always true that it has been done, and yet it is not right to say that it is impossible for God to make what is past not past, for there is no necessity of doing it or impossibility of doing it operating, but the simple will of God, who wills that truth should always, since he is himself truth, be as unchangeable as he is. So if he purposes that he will unchangeably do a thing, although what he purposes could not, before it is done, possibly not be done, since there is not in him any necessity of doing it or impossibility of not doing it, because the only thing that operates with him is his will. For instance, when it is said that God cannot, there is no denial of power in him, but there is signified invincible power and might, and nothing is meant but that no possible thing can bring it to pass that he should do what it is said he cannot. It is a very common phrase to say that a thing can, not because the power is in it, but in something else, and that it cannot, not because the want of power is in it, but in some other thing. For instance, we say that man can be conquered instead of someone can conquer him, and the other cannot be conquered instead of saying no one can conquer him. For to be able to be conquered is not power, but want of power, and not to be able to be conquered is not want of power, but power. And we do not say that God does a thing from necessity, and though in him there were, as though in him there were any necessity, but because there is in another, as I said of want of power, when it is said that he cannot. For every necessity is either compulsion or prohibition, and these two necessities are directly opposed to each other, as are must and impossible. For instance, whatever is compelled to be is prohibited from not being, and whatever is compelled not to be is prohibited from being, even as what must be is impossible not to be, and what must not be is impossible to be, and conversely. Now, when we say that a thing must be or not be with God, it is not meant that there is with him any necessity, either compelling or prohibiting, but it is intended to express that in all of the things there is a necessity prohibiting them from doing and compelling them not to do, contrary to what is spoken of with reference to God. For when we say that God must always speak the truth, and that it is impossible for him ever to lie, nothing else is said, but that it is impossible that anything can make him either to speak the truth or lie. That can make him either not to speak the truth or lie. Therefore, when we say that this man, who in the unity of person, as was said above, is the self-same as God, the Son of God, could not possibly not have died, nor have wished not to die, after he was born of this virgin, it is not intended to express that there is in him any want of power of preserving or of wishing to preserve his own life from death, but that there was an unchangeableness in that will of his, by which he, of his own accord, made himself man, to the end that, persevering in that same will, he might die, and that nothing could have changed that will. For it would have been more the want of power than real power if he could have wished to lie, or to deceive, or to change his will, which beforehand he willed should be unchangeable. And if, as I said above, when a man of his own accord proposes to do some good thing, and with the same will afterwards does what he proposed, although he might be compelled if he refused to fulfill his promise, yet we must not say that what he does of necessity, but of the same free will with which he proposed it. For one ought not to say a thing is done or not done from necessity or want of power, when neither necessity nor want of power have anything to do with it, but only will. If I say it is so with man, much less are necessity and want of power to be even named with God, who does nothing but what he wills, and whose will no force can compel or prohibit. For in this is the value of the diversity of natures in Christ. and the unity of person. And what had to be done for the restoration of men? If the human nature could not do it, the divine nature might. And if a thing was by no means consistent with the divine, the human nature might exhibit it, and not be one or other person, but the self same, who being both perfectly might through his human nature pay what it owed, and by his divine nature be able to pay what it was expedient to be paid. In fact, the virgin who was through faith made pure so that he could be taken of her by no means believed that he was going to die, except because he willed it, as she had been taught of the prophet, who said of him, he was offered because he willed it. Isaiah 53 verse 7. In the Vulgate. Wherefore, since her faith was true, it was necessary that it should be as she believed. But if it again troubles you that I say it was necessary, remember that the truth of the virgin's faith was not the reason why he died voluntary, but because this was to be the case, therefore her faith was true. Wherefore, if it be said it was necessary that he should die of his own will alone, because her faith, the prophecies which went before on this point were true, this is just the same as your saying. It had been necessary for it to be so, for so it would be. But a necessity of this kind does not compel the fact to exist, but the existence of the fact creates the necessity. For there is a necessity going before, which is the cause of the fact taking place, and there is a necessity coming after, which the fact creates. There is a necessity going before and efficient when it is said, the earth revolves because it must revolve, but there is a necessity coming after and of no effect, but simply existing when I tell you, you must speak because you are speaking. For when I tell you this, I mean that nothing can bring it to pass that you cannot speak while you are speaking. Not that anyone compels you to speak. Now the force of its natural condition compels the earth to revolve, but no necessity makes you speak. Now, but wherever there is a necessity going before, but whereas there is a necessity going before, there is also one coming after. Though when there is one coming after, there is not by reason thereof one going before. For instance, we may say the earth must revolve because it is revolving. But it is not likewise true that the reason why you are speaking is because you must speak. This necessity coming after the fact runs through all times. Thus, whatever has been must have been, whatever is must be, whatever is to be must have been going to be. This is that necessity which, where Aristotle treats of singular and future propositions, seems to pull down and to build up everything of necessity. By this necessity coming after and having no effect upon the fact, since the virgin's faith, or the prophecy concerning Christ, that he was going of his own will and not of necessity to die, was true, it was necessary that so it should be. By this necessity he was made man. By this he did and suffered whatever he did, and suffered. By this he willed whatever he did will. For these were so of necessity because they were to be, and were to be because they have been. And if you will know the true necessity of all he had and suffered, know then that all these were of necessity, because he himself willed them. But his will no necessity preceded. Wherefore, if they have taken place only because he willed them to do so, they would not if he had willed them not. So therefore no man took his life from him, but he himself laid it down and took it again, because he had power to lay down his life and power to take it again. As he himself said,
You have satisfied me that he cannot be proved to have submitted to death by any necessity, and I am not sorry that I was so troublesome in begging you to do this.
We have shown, I think, one sure way of accounting for the manner in which God has taken upon him out of the sinful mass a manhood without sin. But it cannot, I imagine, be denied but that there is some other besides the one we have mentioned. For there is this, namely, that God is able to do what man's reason is not able to comprehend. Therefore, however, since even that one seems sufficient for me, and if I wish now to seek out another, I should be obliged to investigate the nature of original sin, and how from our first parents it is diffused through the whole human race, excepting him of whom we are treating, and to touch upon certain other questions which demand a treatise of their own. Let us therefore be content with the reason which we have mentioned, and finish what remains of the task we have commenced. As you will,
But on the understanding that sometime, God helping you, you will hold yourself bound to unravel that other reason which you now shrink from investigating.
I do not refuse, since I know I have the wish to do what you ask, but as I am uncertain of the future, I dare not promise, but commit it to God's disposal. But let me now of the question which you proposed at first, and for the sake of which so many others have been piled upon each other, what part of it seems to you to have been solved, and what is there of it now to be solved?
The root of the question was, why was God made man? In order that by his death he might save men, when it appears as though he might have done this in some other way. This you answered by many unnecessary arguments, and showed that the restoration of the human race ought not to have been left uncompleted, and that it could not have been accomplished unless man paid what he owed to God for his sin. And this debt was so great that although no one ought to have paid it except man, no one could except God, so that the same person should be man who is also God. And hence it was necessary that God should take manhood into oneness of person, so that he who by nature ought to have paid and could not might be in a person which could pay. Secondly, you showed that out of the Virgin and of the person of the Son of God was to be taken that man who should also be God, and you proved how he might without sin be taken from the sinful mass. Now you have proved the life of this man to be evidently so exalted and so precious that it is able to suffice to pay what is owing for the sins of the whole world, and infinitely more too. It remains now to show how this life is paid to God for the sins of men.
If for righteousness' sake he permitted himself to be slain, did he not give his life for the honor of God?
If I can comprehend what I do not doubt, I will confess that although I may not see how he has done this with reason, when he had the power of keeping righteousness unfailingly and of keeping his own life forever, still I will confess that he gave of his own accord to God for his honor, something to which nothing that is not God can be compared, and which is able to compensate for all the debts of all men.
Do you not see that when he bore with calm patience the injuries and insults and the death of the cross with the thieves brought on him on account of his righteousness, which he obediently kept, he gave an example to men that they should swerve from the righteousness which they owed to God for no inconveniences which they may experience, and this he would by no means have given if he could have done. He had refused death brought on him for such a cause.
It seems that there was no necessity for him to give this example. For many before his coming, and St. John the Baptist after his coming, and before his death, by bravely suffering death for the truth, are known to have given a sufficient example of this.
No man beside him ever gave to God by dying what he would not at some point be compelled to lose, or ever paid what he did not owe. But he, of his own accord, offered to the Father what he would not have been compelled to lose, and he paid for sinners what he did not owe for himself. Wherefore he gave a much greater example than each one should not hesitate, when reason requires it, to surrender of himself to God, that which he will sometime lose against his will, who, when he is in no way needed it for himself, or was obliged to do it for others, to whom he is God owed nothing but punishment, gave so precious a life, yea, himself even so great a person, with such a ready will.
You come very near to what I desire, but suffer me to ask something which, although you may perhaps think me silly to ask it, is yet not a question which I could readily answer if it were asked me. You say that when he died, he gave what he did not owe, but no one will deny that when he gave his example in such a way, he acted better and pleased God more by it than if he had not done this, or will say that it was not his duty to do what he knew was better and would please God more. How then shall we assert that he did not owe to God what he did, that is, what he knew was better and would please God more, especially when the creature owes to God all that it is and all that it knows, and that it is able to do? Although the creature has nothing from itself, yet when God grants him liberty to, and not to do a thing, he gives him both to be so far his own, that although one may be better than the other, yet neither is distinctly required, but whether he does the one that is best or the other, he is said to do his duty in what he does. And if he does that which is best, he has a reward, because he voluntarily gives what is his own. For although virginity is better than matrimony, yet neither is distinctly required of men, but both he who chooses to use matrimony and he who chooses to keep his virginity is said to do his duty in what he does. For no one says that he ought not to choose virginity or marriage, but we say that what a man chooses before he decides upon any of these things, that he ought to do. If he keeps his virginity for the voluntary offering which he makes to God, he looks forward to a reward. Therefore, when you say that a creature owed to God what it knows to be best and is able to do, if you mean that he owes it of debt and do not understand if God commands it, it is not always true, since I have said, man is not bound in debt to virginity, but if he so choose, he is bound to use marriage. If the word ought or is bound or owes troubles you, and you cannot understand it apart from some debt, remember that it is sometimes happens that can and cannot and necessity are used not because they exist in the matter, in the matters they are used in connection with, but because they exist in some other sense, in some other case. So also is ought. For instance, when we say that the poor ought to receive alms from the rich, this is the same as that the rich ought to give alms to the poor. For this is a duty required not of the poor but of the rich. It is said also that God ought to be above all, not that he is in any way a debtor in this case, but because all things ought to be subject to him, and ought to do what he wills, since what he wills ought to be. So when any creature pleases to do what is his own, either to do not or not to do, he is said to do what he ought, because what he wills ought to be. And so the Lord Jesus, when he willed to suffer death, since it was his own, either to suffer or not to suffer, ought to have done what he did, because what he willed ought to have been done. For seeing that he is at once God and man, according to his human nature by which he was man, he received from the divine nature, which is distinct from his human nature, the property that whatever he had was his own, so that he was bound to give nothing but what he willed, and yet by his person he so had whatsoever he possessed from himself, and was so perfectly sufficient for himself that neither did he owe any recompense to another, nor did he need to give that he might recompense himself. I see now plainly that he gave himself to death for the honor of God in no way because he was bound to do so, as my reasoning seemed to indicate, and yet he ought to have done what he did. That honor indeed belongs to the whole Trinity. Wherefore, since he is at once God, the Son of God, he offered himself for his own honor to himself, even as to the Father and to the Holy Ghost. That is his manhood to his Godhead, that which is at the same time one of the three persons, whoever that we may, keeping in the selfsame truth, say what we wish more clearly. Let us say, as is usual, that the Son offered himself of his own will to the Father,
since in this way it is most clearly stated both that the whole Godhead is understood to be in one person, to whom he offered himself according to his manhood, and by the mention of the name of the Father and the Son, a certain incomprehensible devotion is experienced in the hearts of the hearers, when the Son is said in this way to entreat the Father for us.
This I most willingly admit.
Let us now see, as far as we can, for what great reason the salvation of man follows from this.
To this my heart leads me, for although I think I understand it, yet I should like to have the same chain of reasoning brought out by you.
Well, there is no need to explain how great a thing it was that the Son voluntarily gave.
No, it is sufficiently clear.
Well then, will you not be of opinion that he who voluntarily gives so great a gift ought to go without a recompense?
No, I see that the Father must recompense the Son, otherwise either he would seem unjust if he would not, or powerless if he could not, both which are contrary to the nature of the Godhead.
He who recompenses anyone either gives what that one has not got, or forgives what may be required of him. Now, before that the Son did so great an action, all things which the Father had were his, neither did he ever owe what might be forgiven him. What recompense then is to be given to the one who is in want of nothing, and to whom there is nothing which can be given or forgiven?
On the one hand, I see the necessity of recompensing him, and on the other, its impossibility, for it is at once necessary for God to pay what he owes, and there is no one to pay it to.
If so great and so due a recompense is paid neither to him nor to anyone else, the Son will appear to have done so great an action in vain.
It is wicked to suppose this.
It must then be paid to someone else, since it cannot be to him.
This is the inevitable consequence.
If the Son wished to give what is due to him to another, could the Father justly prevent him or refuse that other to whom he pleases to give it?
No, I see it both just and necessary that it should be paid by the Father to whomsoever the Son pleases to give it, because it is both lawful for the Son to give what is his own, and that the Father cannot pay what he owes him except to someone else,
on whom he should more consistently bestow the fruit and recompense of his own death, than on those for the sake of saving whom, as the reasoning of truth has taught us, he became man, and to whom, as we said, by dying he set an example of dying for righteousness' sake. For in vain will they be followers of him, if they are not partakers of his merit. Or whom may he more justly make inheritors of what is due to him, of which he is not in want himself, and the superabundance of his fullness, than his own parents and brethren, whom he sees encumbered with so many and such heavy debts, pining away with want in the depth of misery, so that what they owe for their sins may be forgiven them, and that of which by reason of their sins they stand in need may be given them.
The whole world can hear nothing more reasonable, nothing more comforting, nothing more desirable. For my part, I take such confidence from it that I cannot tell you with what joy my heart is gladdened, for it seems to me that though God can reject no man coming to him in this name.
True, if he comes as he ought, but by that what we mean must be partakers of so great grace, and how we must live in it we are taught in every part of Holy Scripture, which is founded on solid truth, and which we have in some sort, God helping us, seen to be built on a firm foundation.
Yes, indeed, whatever is built upon this foundation is founded on a solid rock.
I think I have now somewhat answered your question, although it might be able to do this better at length. And there are reasons for this fact greater and more numerous than either mine or any mortal intellect can comprehend. It is clear that God stood in no need of doing what we have said, but that so unchangeable truth required it. For although what that man did God is said to have done on account of the unity of person, yet God did not require to come down from heaven to overcome the devil, or to contend against him by righteousness to deliver man, but God did require of man that he should overcome the devil, and that he who had offended God by sin should make satisfaction by righteousness. For as much as God owed the devil nothing except punishment, so neither did man owe him anything except that, as he had been overcome by him, he should overcome him again in turn. But whatever was required of him, this he owed to God and not to the devil. Now we find that the mercy of God, which seemed to you to disappear when we considered the justice of God and the sin of man, is so great and is so consistent with justice that we can think of nothing greater or more just. For what can be conceived more merciful than when the sinner has been condemned to eternal torments and has nothing by which to redeem himself? God says, "Take my only begotten Son and give him for thyself." And the Son himself says, "Offer me and redeem thyself." For they do, as it were, say this when they call us and lead us to the Christian faith. Again, what can be conceived more just than he to whom is offered a price greater than all the debt, should, if it be offered with the due disposition, forgive the whole debt? Now the reconciliation of the devil, of which you inquired, you will see to be impossible, if you carefully consider of that man. For as man could not have been reconciled except by the man God, who could die, and by whose righteousness what God had lost by man's sin would be restored, so the condemned angel could not be saved except by an angel God, who might die and who by his own righteousness might make up to God that of which the sins of the others had robbed him. And as it would not have been right for man to have been restored through another man who was not of the same race, though he might be of the same nature, so it would not be right for any angel to be saved through another angel, though we were of one nature, because they are not, as men are, of the same race. For all angels are not so from one angel, as all men are from one man. This again stands in the way of the restoration, that as they fell when no one else tempted them to fall, so they ought to rise again with no one else's help. And this is impossible for them, for otherwise they cannot be restored to the dignity which they would have had, since they would, without any external assistance, by their own power which they had received, have, if they had not sinned, stood fast in the truth. Wherefore, if anyone imagines that our Saviour's redemption ought some time to be extended even to them, he is convinced by reason itself of being unreasonably deceived. And this I do not say as though the value of his death did not in its magnitude far excel all the sins of men and of angels, but because a reason that cannot be altered steadily opposes the restoration of the angels. All that you say appears to me rational, and what nothing can contradict, and by the solution of the single question which we proposed, I see is proved whatever is contained in the New and Old Testaments. For when you thus prove that God must necessarily have been made man, even if a few things which you brought forth be taken out of our books, as what you touched upon of the three persons of the Godhead and of Adam, you would testify not only Jews, but even pagans by reason alone. You would satisfy not only Jews, but even pagans by reason alone. And the same God-man proves the New Testament and proves the truth of the Old, so that it must needs be confessed that he is true. No one can refuse to confess that everything that is contained in them is also true. Now, if we have said anything which ought to be corrected, I do not refuse correction, if it be done with reason. But if what we think we have discovered by reason be confirmed by the testimony of the truth, then we ought to attribute it not to ourselves, but to God, who is blessed forever. Amen. Deo gratias.